And now, from the University of Chicago Institute of Politics and CNN, The Axe Files, with your host, David Axelrod.
In 2010, Ed Miliband shook up British politics by defeating his brother David in a most unusual battle for leadership of the Labour Party. He served for 5 stormy years as leader of Labour, culminating in a crushing defeat in 2015, and in full disclosure, I helped advise him in Labour in that unsuccessful campaign. But I came to know Ed as a bright, caring, committed public servant who really took his responsibilities seriously. Ed came to the University of Chicago's Institute of Politics this week to talk about his experiences and the current state of British politics in the era of Brexit. Ed Miliband, great to see you. Welcome to the Institute of Politics. Your brother was here some time ago, and so some of this history for faithful listeners of this podcast may be familiar, but still important and interesting. I want to talk to you about your folks and their history, which didn't begin in Britain, but during the war. Tell me about their journey.
Well, it's an extraordinary journey, and it makes me feel incredibly privileged. My dad and his father left Belgium on one of the last boats out before the Nazis arrived in 1940 and came to Britain, leaving my father's sister and his mother behind, and they ended up in hiding in a Belgian village, which took in, I think in the end, about 16 of our relatives, all of whom survived the war. So it was a small village that sheltered them.
Your mother's family was not as lucky.
Nope. My mother was born in Poland, in a town called Częstochowa, and she lost her father in a camp, and I'll say something about that in a sec. But she was in hiding in a convent with her, well, not with her sister, because the convent wouldn't take her sister. Then eventually they were taken in by a Catholic family who protected my grandmother, her and her sister. We only just discovered what actually happened to my grandfather, my mother's father. He died in essentially a concentration camp in a place called Heilfingen in Germany.
And your mother did not know what happened to him?
No, I mean, the family law was always that he died in Auschwitz. And it was only by going to Yad Vashem by these 2 incredible, it's like secondary school teachers in this tiny German village, which had essentially kept this secret relatively hidden for a long time, that they were home to this concentration camp, labor camp. And that a mass grave was, a tombstone was put up for a mass grave, and then, my grandfather was one of the people on it. And when I went to Yad Vashem as leader in 2014, leader of the Labour Party, they kind of gave us some information, which then led us on the trail to finding out what actually happened. And then we were later contacted by these 2 extraordinary people, German teachers, who invited us to come over, and we went over on a family trip.
So how much of this was discussed in your home when you were a kid? How much were you aware of the struggles that your family went through?
I mean, not really. Aware, but it was relatively. It wasn't really discussed. I remember going to Israel, because my mother's mother lived in Israel for a long period, and I remember seeing a picture of the person that was actually my grandfather, my mother's, my grandmother's husband, who died in the war, and saying, "Who's that?" And then being told who that was, but I don't think it was very, made clear to me what had happened.
Why is that?
I think for my mother, it was just too painful to talk about. For my mother and grandmother, I once overheard a conversation that my grandmother was having with somebody else, where she was talking about the family law that he'd been taken to Auschwitz. My father was talked more about it. And and my aunt, his sister, who was in hiding in this Belgian village, and these, being a family with of Holocaust survivors, or with and indeed family members who died, it casts a long shadow. But it also, there are inspiring and extraordinary stories of human goodness that comes out.
Well, like the nuns who took in your...
Like the nuns, like this village. The story of this village is
in Belgium.
In Belgium is extraordinary, because and I hope I get this right, but my grandmother sold hats at a market in the 1930s because they were pretty poor. My grandfather, this is on my father's side, was a leather maker, a leather worker. And there was a farmer also, or a farmer's wife, farmer and his wife at this market, and essentially the Gestapo were in Brussels. They called in my grandmother. Miraculously, they let her go, but they said in German to each other, "We'll get her tomorrow, and she'll lead us to the other family members." She understood German and fled to this village. They were hidden in this village by this farmer and his wife. And then gradually more and more of my family members ended up in this village. And the village kept the secret that they had these Jews in their presence.
Now you're a secular. You're not a religious person. Do you feel a sense of identity given this history?
Yes, I do. It's complicated.
Yeah.
But because my parents weren't religious, my mum's still alive. They don't practice. They don't go to synagogue. So they were very secular Jews, and I married somebody who's not Jewish. So I feel it, yes, and I feel it because of the history, and I think that makes one more keenly aware, for obvious reasons,
yes,
of it. And in a way, honestly, I regret a bit that I didn't learn more. Not in a sort of religious belief way, but in a heritage way.
Yeah.
When I was growing up. But my parents' community was a sort of socialist left community.
In fact, your father was one of the most noted scholars on Marxism.
Marxist intellectual, yeah, and he, I think he started reading Marx, probably in Belgium, but then also he joined the Royal Navy and was what they call a headache. He would wear headphones to listen to see if he could intercept German radio signals. I'm not sure he was very good at it, but anyway, he
seems like an important job. I hope he was relatively competent.
He was, but he kind of, I don't know. And then he went to the London School of Economics and so on. So yeah, but it's So their community was a left community. That was what they were the people in our household.
I want to get back to that in a second. I did want to ask you something contemporary related to that. There's been a big to-do about anti-Semitism among some members of the Labour Party, and some of it's been directed at Jeremy Corbyn, who succeeded you as the leader. And I just wondered how you processed all of that.
I think, look, I think I'm very conscious that not to give a running commentary on my successor. And I think that's
I'm just asking for a brief analysis, not a running commentary.
No, I understand. I think what I would say is he has been right to say, because he said this very clearly recently, look, we must be obviously zero tolerant of anti-Semitism. I think he's right also to identify that there is a problem in parts of the far left, but I emphasize parts, and I believe it is a very small minority, where skepticism about what the state of Israel does totally, wrongly, then sort of morphs into anti-Semitism, and that it doesn't seem to me a bit complicated to keep the two distinct. So look, I think he's right to take it seriously, and it's got to be taken seriously.
I guess he got into it a little bit of a jam about some post he made back in 2012, some mural that depicted.
I haven't been there exactly, but I just think he said he didn't see the post. I don't believe he's an anti-Semite, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about your parents and their and their roots in the socialist community in the left in London. Your home was a center of activity because your dad was not just a scholar, but he was a believer. I think he's buried somewhere near
Highgate Cemetery.
Karl Marx, right?
Highgate Cemetery. Yeah, I'm not. I mean, I think maybe it was. Yeah, I think that's sort of coincidental more than. But
there was just space available.
Well, I don't know. Yeah. Look, it was definitely an unusual household to grow up in, because politics was so in the bloodstream, and the people who came round and the
who were some of there were some noted.
So I mean. The thing that really always stands out in my mind is that a woman called, when I was about 12, I met a woman called Ruth First, who was married to, had been a student of my father's and was married to Joe Slovo, the General Secretary of the South African Communist Party.
Yes.
And she was an extraordinary, vivacious, full of life person talking about the struggle in South Africa and so on. She was, I think, at that point living in Mozambique. And then a few months later, she was killed by a letter bomb sent by the South African secret police. And because they couldn't get at Joe and they got at her. Now, if you're a kind of 12-year-old, and I remember coming downstairs and seeing my parents.
You knew about this.
Yeah, I mean, I remember my parents in tears because this kind of close friend of theirs had been murdered, and it's quite hard not to be. Well, you either kind of say I'm going to do something else, or you get engaged. But I think the most important thing about my upbringing in this respect is that, and I try and do this with my own kids, is my parents, particularly my father, took us seriously, even as children, when it came to adult issues. Now, maybe that's more customary these days, but they wouldn't say when we were 11 and said, I think this. Oh, look, you wouldn't understand, wait till you're grown up. They took us seriously. And in fact, I remember these kind of towering people coming around to the house, and me or David would sort of chip in, and, they'd say, oh, I don't think it's quite that way. And then my father would say, well, hang on a minute, I think he's entitled to his point of view. And they'd be sort of slightly taken aback. And I think that is a huge credit to them. And I think that's why we both got engaged in politics. And also, I think it is partly, this is not religious, but it shares some, not religious in their case, but it shares some commonality with religion in that they felt, I think because of their experience, both of them, you should try and leave the world a better place than you found it. That was kind of a really important part of what life was about.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about how the both of you ended up in politics, but you also had some time in the States. Your father came to teach here.
Became a big Red Sox
because
fan.
people wonder how it is that frankly you don't sound like the typical Red Sox fan.
I don't know.
So
yeah. No, so my father was teaching at Brandeis University in Boston when I was
Waltham,
7.
Mass, yeah.
Yeah, Waltham, in 1977, and then he had an arrangement where he used to come back for a semester a year, and I lived with him in Newton when I was 12 for a few months, and I became a big Red Sox fan.
Who was playing for the Red Sox back then?
Jim Rice,
Dwight Evans, Fred Lynn,
Yastrzemski. I saw Carl Yastrzemski's 3,300th hit. I hope I'm right about that, but that's my memory.
Who's going to challenge that?
Yeah, exactly. I sort of have followed it ever since, including the Red Sox are quite a good parable of left politics, aren't they? Because they lost a lot, and then eventually they won.
You're talking to a Cubs fan, so
yeah, indeed.
Their
You're
88 years or whatever it was a rather modest losing
yeah.
streak, the way we think of
Yeah,
it.
so 2004 was a very, very big, an important moment.
And you went back and you went to Corpus Christi College in Oxford, and by your own admission, you weren't exactly like engrossed in your studies. You were motivated as much by organizing. There was some sort of issue about
rent. We protested about the student rents. Student rents, they tried to put the student rents up by 39%. So it was and I was the president of what they called...
I hope you didn't let them get away with it.
We didn't, no. Definitely not. I was the president of what they call the Junior Common Room, which is a student body. It's a relatively small college of a few hundred students, so that's the way the Oxford system works. And so it was my first taste of sort of political organising and political sort of leadership, I guess. I did study as well.
I'm not trying to.
No, it sounds a bit defensive. Sorry, no, indeed.
You're talking to a guy who didn't. Okay, so
I don't believe that. I'm sure you did. I'm sure you're doing yourself down. No, it was interesting because it was sort of it was coalition building. I was trying to get the students to protest and demonstrate and do all kinds of things. It was sort of...
Well, you were kind of raised in that tradition. So.
I was raised in that tradition, yeah. Yeah.
But you didn't. But when you left, you didn't go directly into politics. You kind of went into journalism.
Yeah, I did.
Which is kind of odd because we'll get into it a little bit later. Your views of the media are complicated, to say the least. But what drew you to you worked as a researcher on a show called A Week in Politics?
Yeah, well, it sort of was more the politics than the journalism, I think, is probably the truth. Mm-hmm. No, I did my degree. I didn't get a first, the top degree. I got a 2-1 as an upper second, and if I'd got a first, maybe I would have immediately done postgraduate work. And I sort of thought, what am I going to do? So this job opening came, was just advertised, and so I thought I would apply. And I knew lots about politics, and I was quite, I was always driven by politics. And I remember having this conversation with my father died in 1994, and I remember having this conversation with him shortly before that, and saying, Dad, it's politics that drives me, really, not academia.
How did he receive the news?
Incredibly well. I mean, it's something really important about him. He had a sort of there was a really one of the best things about him in relation to these issues was that yes, he was a Marxist. Yes, he was in some sense a utopian, although he wouldn't have categorized himself as that. But he had a lot of respect for people who tried to get a Labour government. He wasn't one of these people who said, well, look, let's make the crisis of capitalism worse by having the Conservatives in power for 30 years and then maybe the revolution will become a bit quicker, And so he said, look, I know that. I said, I understand that's what drives you. No, that's, and in a way, I think maybe I was seeking his permission that I didn't, because, one of the things about our household was that, as I said, there was respect for politics, but, I suppose the implicit sense was academia was the thing that was really the great intellectual sort of challenge, the great sort of thing to do. So in a way, I guess I was seeking his permission.
We're sitting on a campus, and my wife's father taught on this campus for 50 years and so on, and I got a feeling for the culture of that, and it can be daunting to grow up with a towering intellectual figure. Did you feel weight of that? I mean, he seemed like a pretty challenging person. Yeah. I don't mean that in a negative way, but just a big personality.
I don't know. It's interesting. It's an interesting question. I don't think he was, and this is again something I think about with my kids, at the same time as all these things are true of him, and I don't want to portray him as a saint, far from it, at the same time as this towering intellect, the politics, all of that, he was the father who'd say, he would always be very careful not to say, I don't have time for you. And I'm very conscious of this with my kids. Being leader of the Labour Party, I often didn't have enough time for them.
Yes.
I would knock on his study door, go into his study, see what he was doing. Was he on the phone? And he wouldn't sort of say, please, I'm thinking about, Hegel. I don't have time to play chess or backgammon or, think about your homework. And that was really sort of, I think that is absolutely, that is a really important part of him as a father.
It's interesting that you bring up the demands on your time when you were leader of the Labour Party, because one of my great, and I've written about this, one of my great regrets about my own career is the sacrifices that I asked of my family and my kids in particular, because you can always persuade yourself that what you're doing is so important that you just have to make time for it, and you realize that you can't go back and make the time up for your kids. Now I've met your kids, and they're splendid. So
nice to say.
We can ascribe it to your wife, Justine.
Definitely,
you must have had some hand in this.
She gets 95% of any credit. But here's the truth, and perhaps I'm sort of jumping ahead, but I wish I'd won the election in 2015, the general election. But there's no doubt my relationship with my kids has been transformed by losing the general election.
Yeah.
Because I was, and maybe other people are better at this than me, but even when I was present, I was kind of somewhat absent.
Yes, no, that's exactly right. You become so absorbed that even when you're there, you're not there. That's exactly.
And I think it is the curse of modern politics. I don't know whether there's maybe, as I say, maybe some people are better at it than others, but it is just so. I mean, it's not just I couldn't have come with them to America on a trip, which I'm doing at the moment, which partly what brings me here. But it's that even the daily routine, you're just not around.
Yeah.
I just think it's look,
they're what, not 9 and 10 now?
No, they're 8 and 7.
8 and 7. So they were really young when you 3 years ago when you lost that election.
Exactly.
Did they have any sense of what had happened?
Not really. I mean, I think the first day when we took Daniel to school, I think it was on the Monday. The election was on the Thursday, and I resigned as leader on the Friday. Was sort of parents sort of crying in the playground. So it was sort of he kind of knew that something was up, but.
And he said, "What are you doing here?"
Yeah, well, something like that. No, in general, not. And I think that is important to try and protect your kids from.
Yeah, and it's hard to do.
And cameras outside. If Justine had to say what is the thing she hated most about me being leader, and there's kind of relatively long list, I think. Cameras outside, having cameras outside the house. Yeah. It's just such an it feels like such an, I'm not saying it's wrong or should be stopped, but it feels like such an invasion of privacy.
This was the conversation I had with Barack Obama when he was thinking of running for president, and I told him that my fear for you isn't that you're going to lose, it's that you're going to win. And that you're going to have to, and that your life will be transformed and you won't be able to go back. And it's not just a decision for you, but your family.
I mean, I think I also, at the time, underestimated the effect on Justine and my kids, or Justine more than my kids. I mean, my kids from my absence, but Justine from the pressure.
Yeah.
I think it's partly probably was willful in the sense, or subconsciously willful in the sense that, if you thought about that, well, what are you going to do?
Right.
So you just keep going. But I think it's it just is really, really hard to being the spouse is worse. I think worse.
Well, especially because she had her own. She had her own career.
Yeah.
She's a
environmental
lawyer. Yes.
And part-time judge as well now.
Yeah.
When I first met her, I then became. We were together. I became the climate change secretary.
Yes.
She had to forego some of her work as an environmental lawyer because of potential conflict of interest. Then I became leader of the Labour Party. I mean, I owe her a huge amount of love and everything else, but just I also owe her a debt for.
I'm sure if she were here, she wouldn't ask for rebuttal time on that.
She would not. No.
So let's talk about that your trajectory. You got hired by Harriet Harman, who was working for Gordon Brown then.
Yeah, she was his deputy as a...
And was she already a minister then?
Well, we were in opposition.
Oh, you were in opposition.
So it was 1993.
She was an MP?
Yep, she was the deputy finance spokesperson. And she, for people who don't know, has been a towering figure fighting for gender equality in British politics for 30 years. Longest serving Labour MP.
Right.
You know, longest serving female Labour MP, sort of extraordinary advocate.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to park that thought, because one of the things that struck me is that a number of the people who ended up serving under you as leader were the people who hired you, facilitated your career, and that how and what kinds of challenges that posed. But just jumping ahead, I mean, you advanced, you became, I guess, chair of the Council of Economic Advisors.
Yes, for Gordon Brown. So I was, and then became an economic advisor to Gordon Brown. And I was obviously there for sort of 10 years of New Labour, from opposition 3 or 4 years into government. 6 years. And
then a seat opened up. And this intrigues me for those of you who are not British. There was actually just a small biographical insert, which is that I went to Harvard then for 18 months and taught sort of
on social justice. A course called What's Left, the politics of social justice, and I think we had we did something that people don't normally do. We put up posters around the campus with a photo of Karl Marx, Tony Blair, and somebody else, can't remember who, and we got lots of students. And I had great fun. It was a great training. I mean, it was a great. I know it sounds like an odd thing to say, but it was a sort of, in a way, a training for politics, because it was going to speak in public every week. You'd have to come and tell the students something they didn't know, and you'd have to sort of fake it if you were kind of thinking, I don't know very much.
And you were just
either.
miles away from Fenway Park,
and it was very convenient.
Yes, exactly. So Harvard facilitated your baseball Jones there.
Exactly.
So you ran for the seat in 2005. Yeah. Explain to me, I was asking about this the other night.
Yeah.
Doncaster North.
Doncaster North, yeah.
I'm not there was a vacancy. You weren't from there. You applied to run there to the party.
Yeah.
And you were tapped to run there. That's sort of alien. I mean, it happens here, obviously. Hillary Clinton's ties to New York, Robert Kennedy's were tenuous, but they were, famous people. But this happens often in British politics. You identify a constituency, and then you go and run for it.
It does, and lots of people don't like it for reasons I understand, because they say we want a local person. I mean, my story is this, which is, or what happened, or my story is this. I was very ambivalent about becoming an MP. I wasn't sure I wanted the limelight. I wasn't sure I wanted the sort of scrutiny, all of that stuff. But then I'd kind of been an advisor for quite a long time. I wanted to do something else. And, people were trying to persuade me that it would be something I could do. So this seat opened up, and because, unfortunately, my predecessor got very ill. And I thought, well, I'm not. There are people who are local who are going for it, so I probably won't get it. And it's the vote of the party membership, 300 or 400 local party members. And the first conversation I had with somebody there, he said to me, I don't know why you're ringing me, mate. You're not local. Anyway, an hour later, he was still on the phone to me, because I said, well, look, I'm not pretending I am local, but maybe I can do something for this area, because, of what I'm about as a person. And I then... there was a 3 or 4 week, I think, campaign where I would go around and talk to each of the party members, try and make my case, and then I won, and I was selected. And it's
13 years later, you still represent.
Absolutely, and I'm incredibly proud to be the MP.
But you still don't live there.
Well, I live in both places, so I have a house there and a house in London. But it's this constituency link. I'm sure it's true here too. It's such an important thing for keeping your feet on the ground, and maybe we'll get later on to Brexit. My constituency voted big time.
I think we must.
Big style for Brexit.
Yes.
Most of my friends in London are Remain will remain.
Yeah.
I have a totally different perspective as a result of that. And take any
because yours is a very working class.
Yeah, and take any
constituency.
ex-mining constituency, and take any issue, and it is such an important kind of bellwether for me, if you like.
Yeah, yeah. And once you were elected, then you started moving up in the party hierarchy. And as you mentioned, you had a couple of jobs. I don't know what the minister for the cabinet office and chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster.
Sounds quite posh, doesn't
Lancaster. It? Yes, I feel like I should bow.
You should,
but I don't,
definitely.
I don't know what was that job.
I was annoyed that you didn't bow. What was that job?
It's not the same on a podcast.
I'm still trying to work
anyway.
that out. I'm still trying to work that out. Basically, it's a relatively ceremonial role. You're sort of the Queen's manager of the Duchy of Lancaster.
Huh.
So you're sort of the Queen's appointee, but the people who really manage it are not you.
Yes.
So it's kind of farming
did the
land.
Queen know about
things.
this?
I think maybe she wouldn't have approved, but I think I did get my seals from her at one point.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
That must have been surreal.
It was surreal. I had a number of discussions with her, including when I was climate change secretary. So there we go. I was Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Minister for the Cabinet Office, and so on.
And that put you in the cabinet.
And then the sort of most substantive job I had was as a cabinet minister was the job as climate change secretary.
Yes,
which I did for 2 years, including the somewhat ill-fated Copenhagen summit,
which was the first attempt at a global treaty.
Yeah, to 2009. And worked closely with the Obama administration. Fantastic.
And you raised Britain's commitment in terms of greenhouse gas.
Yeah, it was sort of
emissions.
a relay. It was a sort of relay because my brother had been
who was the foreign minister.
Yeah, he had been the sort of the environment secretary, and eventually I took over the bill he had started, the Climate Change Act, which put into law Britain's commitment to cut emissions by 80%.
Mm-hmm.
And
it had been 50 before that.
60 it had been, yeah.
Oh, I see.
There hadn't been any law until he came along. Then it got raised, and then to 80. And I continue to care massively about this issue.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Now, you know what's obviously you're a student of what's gone on with the U.S. and Trump, President Trump withdrawing the U.S. from the agreement, the Paris Accord that the world. How much impact has that had, and will it have in terms of the world's ability to, and some of the other decisions that have been made, including lowering fuel efficiency standards from where they were raised by President Obama?
I mean, look, I think it's bad. It's bad. It's bad. There are people who say, well, the US states are doing good work and California and all that, and that is absolutely true and full credit to them. But there is not a moment to waste in this mission. And, China has gone on leaps and bounds. I mean, one of the reasons why Paris worked in 2015 and Copenhagen didn't was that the political will had changed. China, India, the US and the progress that was made under President Obama. It was just a different set of things. But we are in a race against time. We are genuine. We've already got 1 degree of warming, and if we're going to meet the very ambitious goals of Paris, 2 degree, keeping warming to below 2 degrees centigrade, never mind 1.5, which is the sort of outer limit of ambition. We have to have the stars have got to be completely aligned, and so it does set us back.
How are your arguments on this received in Doncaster, which you said is a former mining community?
Well, I would say I think people broadly get it, but they ask the question, is it going to be a just transition? And I think if I'm honest, I think this is one of the things that continues to elude the wider environmental movement, which is how you combine climate justice and social justice. And if I'd be self-critical, I think probably we haven't paid enough attention to this. That partly climate change has sat in its own box.
Yes.
This is the thing we've got to do, because otherwise, we're all going to be, the planet will be destroyed. And it hasn't really enough been combined with a sense of, but how do you do this equitably?
Well, and there is an argument to be made that a green economy creates jobs. The problem is that they don't always create jobs for the people who've lost their job.
Exactly. And I think it's sort of it's been too much of an afterthought, I would say, and it needs to be more, front and center.
So, 2010 comes. Labor had been in office, and it was kind of a disastrous time. Talk
The
about
banking
that
crisis,
election.
you mean? No. Or you mean
I'm
for
talking about
Labour?
the economic for labor, yes, and the election of 2010.
Well, sort of political.
Gordon
sort of
Brown had taken
political
over from Blair.
time. You've been in power 13 years. Gordon Brown, who I'd been an advisor to, close to, still am, took over after 10 years of Tony Blair. Really at the sort of fag end of the administration, and it's very. I think what it taught me was it's very hard to reinvent in office. Mm-hmm. I mean, in an odd way, he came into his own with the banking crisis.
Yes,
because it was sort of the moment.
Yeah, he was an absolute expert.
It was the moment
on
made
this.
for him.
Yes.
But I think it was hard. I think it was hard for him, but he'd been at the front line of politics for like 20 years. And, there he was trying to reinvent a government and renew a government. And, it speaks in a way to people's skepticism about him that David Cameron didn't win the election outright in 2010. He had to have this coalition with the Liberal Democrats.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
So
it was sort of...
talk to me a little bit, just for a second, about Gordon Brown versus Tony Blair as political leaders and personalities.
Gosh, that's interesting. These were two people who had been joined at the hip when they came together in 1983, both elected in 1983, Labour's worst election defeat sort of forever, worked incredibly closely together. 1994, John Smith dies of a heart attack.
He's the leader of Labour.
Labour Party. And it had been long assumed that Brown was the senior partner, but all the sort of mood music party will was for Blair. And, theirs was an extraordinary partnership because it was incredibly creative. It did very good things. I've got my criticisms of the government, that government, and I had my criticisms at the time. But, it renewed the public services, it did stuff on anti-poverty and so on. And they were,
for Americans, it was at the same time as the Clinton era,
Exactly.
and there was that same sort of feeling about it.
Yeah, and there was lots of good things, and yet it was built on an incredibly dysfunctional relationship between the two of them, born of what happened in 1994, and Gordon's resentment, and whatever the sort of.
And was there a tacit understanding that someday Blair would cede power to Gordon Brown?
I guess, I guess, but it's.
But
sort
then
of
he gave him the car, and it was sort of out of gas.
Who knows? Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was kind of late. It was sort of a. I think that's probably the car was out of gas was probably a good way of putting it. Look, I have respect for both of them. In a way, one of the things about me is that I try and be respectful of people from all sides, particularly within my party, but even beyond my party. I'm maybe one of the few people in the Labour Party who can talk to, Neil Kinnock, Jeremy Corbyn, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, our living leaders. And I can get on with all of them.
Yeah,
and I sort of see good. I'm not trying to, but I just, they've all got something to contribute.
But and you're among the group, so that's another thing. But
Sure.
but the reality is that you had a fight for leadership in 2010, in which you, in many ways, prosecuted New Labour, which was what the Blair-Brown project was. I'll let you explain.
Yeah. Well, I was definitely the beyond New Labour candidate because I felt New Labour was right, had done good things, as I've said, but I think it got some things wrong about being too relaxed about inequality, about deregulation, about a number of things, particularly domestically. Let's leave aside Iraq, but just a number of things domestically.
Although that was a big issue.
Well, when I say leave aside, I mean I'm talking about the domestic agenda. And Iraq was part of my criticism, but just on the domestic front. And I felt this at the time. And if you talk to Tony or Gordon, they would, I think, say this. I didn't suddenly come along and think in 2010, how do I position myself for this thing? I always felt I was part of the New Labour government, but I didn't feel I didn't feel personally New Labour.
Now, the presumption was that your brother David, who was the foreign minister, would succeed to become the leader. And in fact, when I remember when we were there in 2009 with President Obama, and David was at the table at the bilat, and I remember someone saying, he'll probably be the next leader and so on. And that was the presumption in Britain, certainly was his presumption. And you ended up in a battle for leadership with your brother, which is kind of, I know we already certified that you're a secular person, but it's kind of a biblical story. So tell me about that and the decision to do that and the cost of doing it to you personally.
I mean, it was a very hard decision. And the way I think about it is, of course I wanted to be leader, but I did it because I felt I had a different thing to offer. I had a different thing to offer ideologically about where the party needed to go, but more important, where the country needed to go. I thought there were big things that needed to be tackled, about inequality, about what kind of country we were trying to build. And it was an incredible, it's the hardest decision I've ever made. And it was incredibly tough. But I suppose I was, we talked about Brown and Blair earlier. They weren't brothers. They aren't brothers. But it stored up an awful lot of trouble for the party that one of them stood and the other didn't. Because it was a deal, or wasn't it a deal, or where was it going? And it created dysfunction. Yeah. And so, it was very, very hard to make that decision. But I made it, and honestly, I don't regret it. Because I think I would have regretted more thinking, I had an agenda, a thing for the country, and I decided to kind of hold it back.
You won by less than 1% of the vote. It was a very close fight.
Sure.
And you entered with that. You formed a cabinet of your own. Many of the people in the cabinet were, as I mentioned, people who were senior to you when you started in the party. Some of them were not with you in the fight.
Well, in a way, I mean, by design.
Yeah, team arrivals kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
But the first part is more important to me than the second. And you won kind of an inside game because that's the way the party fights were. And, Lucy Powell, who's now one of your colleagues, was your chief of staff. She said there was no honeymoon. There was no honeymoon.
Nope.
And so I guess my question was, in some ways, were you sort of doomed from the start because of the way this thing was born?
No, I don't think so. I honestly don't think so. And look,
I helped you in 2015, so I have a vested interest in saying you were doomed from the start.
I see.
So I get
I see.
No responsibility.
Well, it's certainly not your responsibility. Look, one of the things, and again, I don't want to jump ahead, but one of the things that I've been very clear about since 2015 is, I was the leader, I made the decisions, I take responsibility for having lost, and I don't think it was doomed. Because there were moments when I was doing a lot better. We were ahead in the polls. I know the polls turned out to be wrong, but even allowing for that, we were ahead. Explaining a defeat, you said to me very nicely after the election, you're never as dumb as you look when you lose or as smart as you look when you win.
I learned that through hard experience.
Yeah, but I've carried it around with me ever since. But I think it's sort of, I think it's hard to explain, but I think it's a combination of people didn't buy me as compared to Cameron.
Let me ask you about that because, in Britain, money plays less of a role in campaigns, but the British media plays a very
They weren't friendly to me.
big role.
They weren't friendly to me. But you know what? Look, they did. I was going to say they didn't buy me, but I think there's a more substantive thing here, which is, and maybe it goes to the wider challenges of the left, is that I think I was caught, and maybe this is implicit in your question about the way I won. I was caught between those who wanted reassurance, who didn't find me reassuring enough, and those who wanted radicalism, this is the voters, who didn't find me radical enough. Now, actually, oddly enough, a lot of my 2015 manifesto is now being proposed by Jeremy Corbyn, some of it implemented by Theresa May.
Who did answer the radical call.
Jeremy, yeah.
Yes.
And so, I often felt when I was running, actually, if there's one thing I did feel at the time, it's we've got a big, bold analysis of these problems of inequality, of the next generation doing worse than the last, of the problems the country faces. Are our answers bold enough? And so, you know, I think, well, I don't think it was written in the stars, basically.
You've had a running battle with Rupert Murdoch, who's a powerful figure in Britain. He's been in the midst of trying to acquire Sky News, which is a major institution there. He already owns quite a few assets in media there. Why have you opposed that? And what's the status of that? And just as we started talking, the European Union apparently invaded his offices, and we don't know what the substance of that is. And is that likely to affect this issue?
I will say you're on top of breaking news here at the
Yes, we
X-Files.
are. Yeah, I know. We're going to give
You've
the
got
weather in a second.
Finger on the pulse. So I don't know. I mean, it's obviously dramatic news, this European Commission raid, but I don't know what it's in connection with. The broader context, my run-in with him started in 2011 when they were exposed, his newspapers as having, or the News of the World as having hacked the phone of a girl who turned out to have been kidnapped and killed,
Yes.
Millie Dowler. It led to a whole set of
people went to jail.
criminal convictions, a big inquiry, and all that. He was at the time trying to take over Sky News. He currently owns 39%, or his company Fox owns 39% of it. He then withdrew the bid at the time, you know, with great humility and all of that stuff. Partly Parliament forced him to, but he's come back. And I think Rupert Murdoch's got a lot of influence in Britain, and he doesn't need any more. And so I'm in a fight with him about whether it's going to go ahead. It's with the regulatory authorities at the moment. He seems quite irritated by me. It's a cross-party group of politicians, so former Conservative Chancellor Kenneth Clarke, Liberal Democrat Vince Cable, and my colleague Lord Faulkner, former Lord Chancellor, all taking this fight on because we just care about public discourse. And, you know, to put it simply, we don't want Fox News in the UK.
You seem almost giddy about the fight. It reminds me of Franklin Roosevelt said during his battles with Wall Street, so the malefactors of great wealth hate me, and I welcome their hatred.
But, you know, the thing about this was that when he launched this bid in December 2016, everybody said to me, oh, well, it's just going to go through this time. There's nothing we can do. And if there's one thing I learned, maybe it's from some combination of Gordon Brown and my father, is you don't take no for an answer. I mean, you don't sort of say, oh, well, this fight's too big a fight to take on. Let's just sort of sit this one out.
I don't know if you know this, but he's got quite a bit of influence in American media as well.
Indeed. And that's what, you know, we don't want, as I say, we don't want Fox News. And Fox News is a standing example of the kind of media you don't want. We have quite strong rules on broadcasting, actually, in the UK to try and prevent that. But I think, you know, Rupert Murdoch has got such a long track record of circumventing rules that I think, you know, he owns he owns the largest newspaper group. You know, he gets radio interests online. You know, enough already.
Yeah. What about the performance elements of politics? You know, you're someone who's steeped in the substance of it. But, you know, you were being judged as a as a performer, and there was the famous bacon sandwich incident where you were choking on a bacon sandwich, you got caught by the camera, and as you say, with
choking is slightly too strong, but it looked like it.
With a hostile media, those things go viral very quickly, and they served a meme.
But what's really interesting about this is that they tried to attack me on my agenda. He wants to take us back to the 1970s, when I would propose freezing energy prices or, taking land away from developers who sat on it to build public housing. And they'd say, and it didn't work, the ideological attack. And so they sort of went for a character attack. He's weird, he's this, that, and the other. And that sort of had an impact, But
did it bother you?
Yeah, well, I think it bothered me that I lost. It didn't bother me at the time. I sort of thought it was ridiculous. Mm-hmm. I thought, if I'm going to lose the election over a bacon sandwich, oh, for goodness sake. I don't think I lost over the bacon sandwich. I think it's deeper. I think the other thing I would say, I take full responsibility for what happened. I could have made different decisions. I've said that I think I could have been bolder. I think there's also, it was a bit of an uphill struggle, in part because it was the first election the Tories were facing. And the kind of British people think, well,
first re-election.
Yeah, first re-election. Sorry, the sort of default option is to give you another. Well,
another thing happened in the election, which was there were all these cross currents. You had a Scottish National Party that was,
which
on the rise. You had Nigel Farage, who was sort of the Donald Trump of Britain, who was talking about breaking free from Europe and anti-trade and some of the themes that have now animated Brexit, Trump, and so on.
And you also had David Cameron, who was willing to call a European referendum.
Which you think you oppose
to put it very mildly, too little regard for the potential consequences, which I wasn't willing to do. And
where's that going now, by the way? Now that you were at Brexit.
Badly.
How's it going to end?
I fear not well.
I know, but what does not well mean?
Well, let me explain. And we talked about this a lot. I haven't talked about your excellent advice you gave me, but we talked a lot about the European thing, and I was clear it was the wrong thing to do for the country because it was an issue that 15% of people cared about, but it was going to suddenly become, if I'd won the election. And I talked to Tony Blair and others about this, it would become my sole focus. Mm-hmm. Now, that was when I thought we'd win the referendum. So I was not in favour of the referendum. I was for remaining in the European Union, but we lost narrowly, 52-48. You might say, as somebody said to me recently here, how can a country on one day decide to sort of change its future without any kind of constitution or process or anything? But I'm afraid that is what happened. We went into it saying it was a one-off. I think it's very hard to redo. I'm not in the redo camp. My constituency, as I said earlier, voted very significantly for Brexit. So we're going to have to make the best of it. And that means, in my view, you respect the referendum result. So we are leaving. But you seek as close a relationship as you can outside the European Union in relation to trade and foreign policy and these other issues. And it's going to be an imperfect answer. But I think we're this is the the hand we've been dealt.
Theresa May her numbers had ticked up a little, and the supposition is it's because she had the opportunity to handle something that was sort of in her wheelhouse, which was this poisoning of these two Russians with nerve gas, presumably by Russia, and she was pretty tough in response. First of all, explain why so many Russians settle in London and why it's become a hub of activity for Russians.
Well, look, it goes to big politics and economics, which is that I'm afraid the British model for economic success has partly been, let's just attract as many rich people as possible, never mind sort of the provenance of their riches.
Yeah,
and
not taxing them.
And we had this absolutely crackers thing called the non-domicile rule, which allows you to
tried to change when you were running.
Which means you can be sort of resident and but so-called not domiciled, so you don't pay proper taxes. And the argument in the Treasury was always, the Greek tycoons will leave. Well, anyway, the Greek tycoons have been replaced or supplemented by Russian oligarchs, and
without much oversight.
Without proper oversight, you've got properties being bought. I think it's something like 80,000 properties in the UK, which are bought through anonymous shell companies based in UK tax havens. if there's one good thing that might come out of this dreadful poisoning, it's that now there's some more focus on these wider issues, and maybe we're going to do something about it. But it's bad, and it's not good for the country either. I mean, I think the price we pay for having these folk there, what it does to the housing market, et cetera, is not good.
Has she been tough enough on Putin?
I mean, I think she's been right to act. But I can't sit here and say, I'm not going to be critical of her because I don't know quite. It's hard to know how you would do what exactly needs to be done. But I think, look, the world faces a massive challenge in relation to Putin, which is, can we act in concert? How do we act in a way that really sends a message to him on some of these things? It was
the expulsion the mass expulsion of diplomats was a good thing to do, and she was the impetus.
It was a good thing to do, but it was, as you say, as you imply, it was relatively modest. I mean, I do think, like the Magnitsky Act, which people have talked about,
sanctions against the oligarchs,
sanctions against people. I mean, I think we've got to look at all of that big spectrum of options.
In 2013, you led as the leader a move to block Britain from joining in an attack on Syria after the use of chemical weapons. And that had a reverberative effect because President Obama felt he had to go to Congress, and Congress rejected that as well, and he ultimately didn't move forward. We're now, as we sit here, we're experiencing new evidence of chemical attacks by the Syrians, and there's been, since that time, extraordinary suffering, millions of refugees, many, many people killed and injured. Do you ever look back at that and say, maybe I didn't make the right call?
I mean, of course I think about it, but no. And look, I think the thing that people sometimes forget about this was that the proposition on the table was a strike, not a strategy. And the thing that I always felt was the lesson of Iraq was that if you're going to engage in military intervention, it needs to be part of a strategy. And, ultimately, that's why I had the skepticism I did about the proposal on the table. I know President Obama, in an interview, I believe in The Atlantic, also said in retrospect he felt that the proposal was a sketchy...
Because both Britain and the U.S. would have become... engaged in a way from which there was no...
But it wasn't even a proposition to get rid of his chemical weapons, because you couldn't hit the chemical weapons stockpiles. That wasn't the proposition on the table. And so, and after all, President Trump also did actually bomb last year, and yet, this is not to take away from the appalling suffering that the Syrian people have faced, and that and what was happening in Syria is ghastly, and of course there is a collective responsibility in the international community for that having happened, but I don't buy the argument about 2013.
Something else that you did as leader was you changed the party rules, and you made it possible for people to sign up, buy a membership in the party, and participate in the leadership vote. It changed the way leaders were elected, and it really empowered Jeremy Corbyn, who inspired this movement, a lot of young people to come into the party. But he also is as left, probably, as you've seen in some time there. Is Corbyn in a position, is he the right person to lead Labour into an election?
Yes. And he's proved that in the 2017 general election. I mean, it's really important for your audience to realise, first of all, how unlikely it was that Corbyn would become leader, but secondly, how the whole political class got the 2017 election in Britain wrong. I mean, this was a guy languishing on 25% in the polls who got 40%, who nearly won the election. Now, he didn't win the election, but...
By energizing people, you felt.
But by offering bigger answers. By offering bigger answers than had previously been available. And look, I do think these are the contours of politics today, which is that people are really hurting. You and I talked about this a lot. I think that was one of the reasons we ended up working together, was we shared this sense good work isn't rewarded, young people feel they can't get on, there are these vast gulfs of wealth and income, And I think unless the left offers big answers and is for the change, not the status quo, and in a way what I'm saying to you about myself, and you could also say this perhaps about what happened in the US in 2016, is that I was too much the status quo. I didn't feel I was, but I wasn't enough change. Unless you offer that big sense of change, you're not going to mobilize people. And if you do offer that big sense of change, there is huge potential for mobilisation. That's why Corbyn did so much better. There are Labour MPs around me in the House of Commons who would say to you, I had no idea I was going to win the election. I was going to be here until 10 o'clock on election night, and maybe 11 o'clock, and maybe midnight, and I was, I'm sitting on a majority of 5,000, 10,000, high by British standards in a parliamentary seat. I had no idea where the voters came from. I mean, it is in that sense a remarkable election, 2017.
We've already certified that polling has been a little bit unreliable.
Off, yeah.
Yes, but I looked at some recent polls, I think from YouGov maybe. What was interesting to me is that much less hospitable to Corbyn himself as a leader than to the Labour Party. And I'm wondering why that is.
I think that's gone up and down, to be honest. It may have taken a dip recently, but I think it's been up and down. Look, there's no question that he faces media challenges, which I face, but he faces if you like, even bigger. The Daily Mail, one of our biggest selling newspapers, ran 13 pages on why he was a terrorist sympathiser just before the election. Yeah. The Sun, equally, the mainstream media has got it infam. He's faced problems inside the party. He was such an insurgent that he's faced problems in the party. But, I kind of think it's part of my role, just speaking for myself, not as a member of his shadow, cabinet, his shadow government, but as a backbencher to try and support him with ideas.
It's interesting you say that, because I'm wondering what it's like to go from being the leader one day to a backbencher the next. I mean, just psychologically, how does one work one's way through that?
It's like that episode of The West Wing, where Arnie Vinnick, you don't watch The West Wing, do you?
Yeah, no, of course.
You do. Where Arnie Vinnick
been
goes
off the air for a few years.
And he says coffee for Arnie, and they say coffee for Ernie. He goes into Starbucks. It's slightly like that. Look, it's hard. I mean, it's definitely hard. Coming to terms with defeat is hard. I've got into the podcast business.
Yes, I wanted to ask you about that.
Inspired by the X-Files.
Reasons to be cheerful is the name of the podcast.
Inspired by the X-Files. But the reason, Reasons to be Cheerful is not the name I came up with. It's the name my co-host Jeff Lloyd came up with. But I think it's a very good name because we talk about interesting ideas that can change the country. From housing ideas to ideas about land taxes or the universal basic income or transgender rights. What are the things to feel positive and optimistic about that can build a left future? And I said when I resigned as leader, I may not be leader anymore, but I can still pursue my ideas. And that's what I sort of care about. And do
you see yourself re-entering, in a leadership role?
As leader?
Not as, well,
no.
I presume not as leader, but what about as a member of the cabinet? If there is another Labour government?
Not at the moment. Yeah, maybe. Maybe.
But you want to stick with politics. You have no...
Definitely. And kind of right from the get-go after 2015, I suppose I felt a number of things. I felt, I'm not going to blame anyone else. It was my defeat. I'm going to try my absolute damnedest to be loyal to my successor because I know how tough the job is and I know it's not great when people who used to do the job are, sort of not being, not being positive. And
you don't feel you got full support from your predecessor?
No, I'm not saying that, but I'm just sort of...
You are saying that, but we'll let it go.
I know how tough it is when you have noises off from any quarter, basically. And thirdly, I'm not going to let this... It obviously defines my life in one sense, but I'm not going to let the defeat sort of, define kind of who I am for the rest of my life. I'm going to... Because there's all kinds of ways you can contribute in politics. Now, the third part's been hard. And in a way, the 2017 election was my moment of release a bit because the last election was not my election, and it sort of meant I kind of came through it. But look, to answer your question in a long-winded way, it's really hard.
Yeah. What did you learn about yourself from it?
What did I learn about myself?
You were saying, it was interesting, you were saying before that everybody says, gee, if everybody could see you the way you are now, you would have won that election.
I know. The people often write into me at the podcast and say, I want to apologize for not having voted for you if only I'd known what you were like. And, on social media, people often say, oh, why wasn't he like this before? I could have been looser, I guess, as leader. I've learned that. But what did I learn about myself in the sort of adversity context? That my family was, Justine and my kids, incredibly important sort of rock and ballast to me. That I need an engaging project, which the podcast is part of, as well as my constituency.
Nothing better than podcasts.
Sorry?
Nothing better than
podcast. But Prime Minister may be slightly better, but, close run thing.
Less trouble, though.
Yeah, the podcast.
Yes.
Yeah, no, indeed. Engaging in ideas. And also, the interesting thing about being a leader is, okay, you get recognized a lot in the street. You get a much more positive view of the electorate than you would get reading a newspaper. The number of people, I've been sustained by my family, but also all the nice people who come up to you on the street and say, look, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry you lost. Or, sometimes I was comforting people who were in tears on the street, and I was sort of saying, well, gee, it was me that lost. But people are nice, and people tell you interesting things about their lives and what's happened to them and so on. So I think it's a combination of all those things.
Well, I appreciate you telling us about your life. And I'm happy that you're hanging in there, man. You and I have had long conversations about this. Service is important. It's not just about like who's up and who's down, and what title you bear. It's the chance to get things done that might have an impact on the future, impact on people's lives. That's a privilege, and it's great that you didn't walk away.
Well, thanks. And, at the risk of mutual back scratching, the reason I was so proud to have you working with me was because people said sometimes he was a political consultant. You're not a political consultant. You're somebody who cares deeply about social justice and things I care about. And that's why it's great that you worked with me, and it's great that you're a friend.
And that will continue. Thanks, Ed Miliband.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to The Axe Files, part of the CNN Podcast Network. For more episodes of The Axe Files, visit cnn.com/podcast and subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite app. And for more programming from the University of Chicago Institute of Politics, visit politics.uchicago.edu.